to the January 13th Global News Review. I'm Patrick Ryan, President of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. With me today are Ambassador Dick Bowers and Dr. Breck Walker. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, Patrick.
Hey, Pat, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Well, we left off with Ambassador Bowers last week at about 2 o'clock Central Time as we were finishing up our global news review, looking to his left at his television there and telling us that there was a invasion of the U.S. Capitol going on. And here we are a week later, and in the background on my television is the impeachment hearings, second impeachment of President Donald Trump. So it's been quite a week in American history and the fate and fortunes of U.S. democracy. Before we get into our program, do you fellows have any comments that you want to add to what's going on in the atmosphere?
Breck.
Well, it's certainly a historic period, and they'll be writing about this in the history books, I think, and in the general survey American history books 50 years from now. So it's been interesting to watch and, of course, disappointing at the same time, but it's historic.
Yeah, it's historic, and I'm very concerned that we as a people seem to have lost much of our common purpose. The boundaries of unacceptable behavior seem to have widened quite a bit, and people are doing things that are very, very detrimental to our democracy and our way of life. So we're going to have to pull our pants up and get moving if we're going to save this thing.
Yeah, well, it'll be an interesting week to come. A week from today, President-elect Biden will be sworn in. We'll have a new president, new administration. But the prospects for violence between now and then are very high. To listen to the security experts, the FBI and all the agencies in Washington are on high alert and very concerned. I tell you, it's a pretty ugly scene seeing 7-foot barricades get erected around the Capitol. You guys
and the
spend
fact
time
that
in Washington, and you kind of get used to just walking around and walking up the steps and going past the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue, and now it's like a fortress up there.
Yeah, and the fact that the U.S. military's highest commanders have sent the letter to the troops, reaffirming what their job is to promote and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That's unprecedented in our history.
No, that's a staggering event. Secretaries of Defense from both parties, former secretaries from both parties, and maybe the reaction, other than in my mind, the reaction to what happened, except by the most loyal Trump supporters, has been so negative towards what happened that maybe we've hit the low point, and that's going to bounce us back a little bit and get people thinking about the things that you're talking about, Dick, about how we behave in the United States of America.
What is truth and what are facts, and what can we agree on? What kind of people do we want to be? All that's sort of in play at the moment, it seems to me.
Yeah. Yep. For sure. Okay.
Some of the Trump supporter costumes, though, will make good Halloween costumes come next October, maybe.
It was quite a scene. You can't make this stuff up. It's pretty incredible. All right, let's jump in. Dick, why don't you start us off with our topics for this week?
Well, we got 3 topics we're going to hit on today, Pat and Breck. We're going to talk a little bit about the international reaction to the attack on American democracy by the insurrection and riot at our Capitol. And then we're going to talk about Secretary of State Pompeo's 11th hour move on Taiwan. What's going on at the last week or so of this administration's in office, and what are we doing with Taiwan? And then we're going to talk about Iran and the 20%ers. It's only uranium. What's Iran up to, and why are they enriching uranium? So those
Okay.
are the three.
Great. Breck, question of the week. I don't think we have any foreign names or pronunciation here.
I haven't had to have any pre-quiz announcement training yet, but the question of the week is, 2/3 of Americans surveyed this weekend believe President Trump bore responsibility for a deadly mob attack on the United States Capitol on January 6th. What official tenet of U.S. foreign policy was undermined by the attack? And as you can see, the possibilities are A, multilateralism, B, promotion of democracy, C, validation of office holders' fitness, and D, security of the seat of government. And we'll have the answer to that at the end of the program.
Terrific. Well, as you know, we could probably talk for many hours about what's going on in the domestic front with the attack on the Capitol last week. But what we concern ourselves with here at the World Affairs Council is looking at what's going on in the world. And definitely this was not just a local or even national event. It's had worldwide implications. So Dick, why don't you start us off with what we're seeing in terms of reaction around the world, and we'll dive in a little bit to the importance of, as our question of the week suggests, what tenet of American foreign policy is affected by all this.
Well, this was a riot that was felt around the world. And perhaps one of the way to start out here is to take a quote from the president of the Council on Foreign Affairs, Richard Haass, who put it this way. What took place last week was a distinctly American failure, but the consequences go far beyond American shores. A post-American world, one no longer defined by US primacy, is coming sooner than generally expected. Less because of the inevitable rise of others than because of what the United States has done to itself. So if January 6th leads to collective soul searching and internal reform, the United States can begin to regain the soft and hard power it will need to help manage great power rivalry and contend with global challenges. As always, foreign policy begins at home. A post-American world will not be dominated by the United States, but it does not have to be led by China or defined by chaos. So I think in general, as far as general reactions go, our friends and allies were appalled, aghast, and shocked. And our adversaries and enemies saw the riot as proof that America is morally bankrupt and that democracy really does not work. As the chaos unfolded, several foreign embassies in Washington issued stay-at-home notices for their citizens, and European leaders begin deploying the language usually reserved for incidents in which democratic values and the rule of law are under siege. In the United Kingdom, for example, Prime Minister Boris Johnson stated that, "I want to say that all my life, America has stood for some very important things, an idea of freedom and an idea of democracy." And so far as he encouraged people to storm the Capitol, and insofar as the president has consistently cast doubt on the outcome of a free and fair election, I believe that he was completely wrong. In Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that Canadians are deeply disturbed and saddened by the attack on democracy in the United States, our closest ally and neighbor. Violence will never succeed in overruling the will of the people. Democracy in the US must be upheld, and it will be. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who rarely comments on the internal affairs of the alliance's member states, urged Americans to respect the outcome of the November election. And German Chancellor Angela Merkel said that riots made her feel angry and sad. A basic rule of democracy, she said, is that after the election, there are winners and losers. Both have to play their role with decency and responsibility so that the democracy remains the winner. And she added that she regretted very much that President Trump did not admit defeat in November. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu described the violence as disgraceful and said it should be vigorously condemned. Lawlessness and violence are the opposite of the values we know Americans and Israelis cherish, he said. And we have friendly leaders from the Pacific who responded as well. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison condemned what he called the very distressing scenes of violence. And New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern tweeted, "What is happening is wrong. Democracy, the right of people to exercise a vote, have their voice heard, and then have that decision upheld peacefully, should never be undone by a mob." Now, on the other hand, we have comments from our adversaries and enemies. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani mocked the chaos unleashed on the US Capitol by President Donald Trump's supporters and said it exposed the fragility of Western democracy. What we saw in the United States yesterday evening and today, Rouhani said, shows above all how fragile and vulnerable Western democracy is. We saw that unfortunately the ground is fertile for populism despite the advances in science and industry. And Rouhani called Trump a populist and said, and I quote, "A populist has arrived and he has led his country to disaster over these past 4 years." In Russia, Putin was silent, but others were not. Konstantin Kosachev, the chairman of the Russian Upper House Foreign Affairs Committee, said the storming signaled the derailment of American democracy. "The celebration of democracy is over," he said. "Alas, this is rock bottom. I say this without a hint of gloating. America no longer defines the course and therefore has lost the right to set it, and even more so to impose it on others." And finally, China reacted to the storming of the US Capitol by comparing it to the wrecking of the Hong Kong legislature. And Chinese web users still remember the distress and anger they felt when they saw rioters in Hong Kong storming the Legislative Council complex, scrawling graffiti, smashing and robbing items. And instead of condemning the violence, US politicians hailed the courage of these mobs. And that's a quote from the state-backed Global Times newspaper. A pro-Beijing lawmaker, An Chiang, in Hong Kong, posted a video of the turmoil in the US on her Facebook page with the caption that read, "American lawmakers can finally experience this democratic violence and get a taste of what it is like for the legislature to be occupied." So that's just some take from friends and foes. Let me just stop and then maybe we can discuss it a little bit by saying that in my diplomatic career, America was seen as a shining city on the hill and a beacon of hope and a beacon of democracy. Our democracy was the envy of the world. Last week's insurrection has dimmed that beacon of hope and that light, and we have much work to do to restore our democracy and our position in the world. What happened on the Capitol was a major blow to the ability of the United States to carry out successful foreign policy. So on that, we got work to do, gentlemen.
We do. I was particularly taken by the Chinese jumped on this very quickly and loudly and relentlessly. There was a lot of commentary, as you pointed out, and we'll put up some Twitter input here. They really likened what had happened at the U.S. Capitol to the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement, what's been going on there for the past couple of years. You can see some of the pictures that were put up and comparing Washington with Hong Kong. So, you know, when the State Department, I think within the last week, there was a number of statements from the State Department talking about promotion of democracy around the world. And it's got to sound really hollow to anybody around the world who's paying attention.
And I think State Department also sent out a worldwide shut up order to the embassies that we have around the world, saying that basically they should not comment on what is going on at all. Just let it play out in the news. And there were a series of diplomats who, I think it was 30 some. I have not been able to get my hands on the telegram they sent in using what's called the dissent channel. So back in the Vietnam War, a particular channel, a telegraphic channel, was set up so diplomats could dissent from existing policy directives, and it would be kept as an in-house discussion. The idea being that people who think the policy is wrong should be able to express their opinions, and the leadership should know that they have a whole bunch of other ideas out there from the troops. So this has gone in, and things, just so much going on. It's kind of hard to grasp the whole thing.
Yeah, I saw that report as well, Dick.
And Pompeo was planning to go to Europe, to Belgium, and cancel the trip at the very last moment because the various European leaders basically refused to meet with him. So that doesn't sound like a good idea, right?
Dick, I just wanted to add, you and I were talking about this before the program started, that last week when former secretaries of defense across different political parties and every living former secretary of defense published a letter in the Washington Post that basically reminded the military establishment of their constitutional responsibilities in a time of turmoil. And it's staggering in any kind of historical sense that an act like that happened in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that preceded January 6th. Is that your recollection, Breck?
Yes,
it came out.
Yes, it did. But then in the last couple of days, all of the heads of all of the military services issued a letter to all U.S. troops around the world about their responsibilities under the Constitution and how they should behave and make sure they defend our country and don't get involved in things that shouldn't be getting involved in.
Yeah, the word unprecedented has been beat to death, but clearly statements like that, and we've seen in the past couple of years national security officials lining up with similar statements on this or that complication of what's been going on in national security issues and foreign policy, but
Right.
the military statements. And then there was General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, after the protests at Lafayette Park, in which he was walking across the park in that display. You may recall the president holding up the Bible, and General Milley was very embarrassed that he had been involved in that, and put out a video and a statement to the troops that he had made a mistake in getting involved in that, and the military had no role in the political events like that.
Dick, I also wanted to add something to your earlier point that the foreign reaction, particularly the Western-oriented foreign reaction, has a lot to do, in my mind, with their view that instability in the United States government creates foreign repercussions that are not knowable, perhaps, but are definitely not positive from the standpoint of Western and Eastern, for that matter, democracies, that this is something that emboldens our adversaries, that gives credibility to authoritarian governments, and denigrates sort of the Western political moral code. So it's more than just what happens in the U.S., which is bad enough, but it's also what happens internationally.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on with that, Breck. I mean, the world looks to the United States for leadership, or has. Whether it will continue to do so is really kind of up to us and what kind of a nation we want to become. So we have to decide what do we stand for? How important is our democracy? How do we combat the rule of the lie when you spout lies all the time and then you accuse somebody else of being the liar? So we'll see what happens. We have a week, right? And the capital
Well,
is going to get buttoned down, and then we'll have a new president, and we'll see where we go with this. And then what's going on today with the impeachment episode, and interesting times, gentlemen.
yeah, I think Senator Romney said it well when he made the point that the dissemination of truth is the mark of leadership. So we need to get back to the disinfectant of truth among us, and you know what happened there was just simply the product of disinformation and everything we've been talking about cyber issues and information on all the social media and building up and playing on people's frustrations. But now we're at a criminal element. And you know, last week, the night before the riots on January 5th, we had Malcolm Nance in a terrific webinar, and I suggest that people take a look at that on our youtube.com/TNWAC video archive channel. Malcolm, we started talking about the Nashville bombing, and then rolled into domestic terrorism, and he got in very deep with this QAnon philosophy, and you know, it's unimaginable that people are buying this stuff. You know, the deep state and pedophiles, and it's incredible.
All of which is not true. And that's the amazing thing. And it's not just a US phenomenon. I mean, QAnon has followers all around the world now.
Right.
And the Falun Gong were involved somehow, mysteriously, in the riot. They were in Washington, D.C. supporting Trump for some reason. So.
Okay. Well,
on that bright note, Mr. Ryan, I think one of the good things that you kind of looking for something that to hang your hat on a little bit is that our friends.
Sure, let us have a little bit of optimism.
Our friends are standing by us. They are with us. They are shocked and appalled, but they are not giving up on us, and they are really, you know, encouraging the United States to get its act together and make sure our democracy functions properly. So we will see what happens a week from now with Mr. Biden as president.
Well, you make a very good point. And the U.S., the British ambassador, the UK ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Pierce, she was interviewed on a program called The World, which is a national public radio program, and you can download the podcast. I suggest you either tune in 2 o'clock Central Time every day, or check it out online at just Google for The World, NPR. She was interviewed, and she was very supportive of the United States prospects of getting past this speed bump and moving on. And then she talked with the Atlanta World Affairs Council the other day, and similarly enthusiastic about the relationship between the UK and the US, and that they were unwavering in their belief that better days were ahead. So let's end this segment on a touch of optimism and turn towards Dr. Breck Walker, who's going to tell us what the heck's going on with specifically Taiwan. But Breck, it looks like there's a lot of items on the to-do list of the Secretary of State, who is checking off these things, and some say planting landmines for the incoming Biden administration. So let's look at the case of Taiwan.
Right. Hey, and Pat, let me add one more thing of optimism, if it's okay. What was it? I think it was Churchill, but I may be wrong, that had the quote that at the end of the day, the United States always does the right thing. You can depend upon it, although you can also depend upon the U.S. trying every other possible solution before they hit upon the right thing. So maybe we have tried the Trump administration, and notice I say Trump administration, not a Republican administration. I think they're two different things, but we've tried a Trump administration, and now maybe we'll move on to something else for a long, long time. Anyway, on Taiwan.
Hear, hear.
So Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced this past Saturday that he is lifting all restrictions on how U.S. officials deal with Taiwanese officials. And before this announcement, there had been, I think, 40 years roughly of the U.S. not treating Taiwan as a sovereign state in terms of diplomatic formalities, that there's no exchange of ambassadors, that there are very limited meetings between government officials. It's sort of a charade that our relationship with China since 1979 has required. Because the Chinese believe that Taiwan is a renegade province. It's not an independent country. And the U.S., as well as most of the rest of the world, has acted like this is the case, at least on the surface, in terms of intergovernmental relations and no official contact. So Pompeo's now said no more such niceties. And the People's Republic of China, the PRC, has lashed out at this. They said, quote, the Trump administration, in its continuing efforts to burn the house down before leaving office, has crossed a dangerous red line with China. So what is this ruckus all about? And if it's okay, I'm going to give a 2-minute quick history that I think is necessary to sort of understand the issue. But China had a 20-year civil war that ended in 1949, and the communists under Mao Zedong won. And they took over the Chinese state, establishing the People's Republic of China, the PRC. The former government of China, and a government that had been the ally of the U.S. during World War II, and that's Chiang Kai-shek, as he was known in those days, and his Kuomintang party supporters, they lost. They fled to the island of Taiwan, which is 100 miles off the mainland, and they set up the Republic of China, or the ROC. Now, both sides, after the Civil War, claimed to be the legitimate government of the Chinese people. And the West, including the United States, recognized Taiwan as that legitimate government for the next 20 years. The communists under Mao Zedong on the mainland were tarred, by the West at least, as an outlaw regime. But in 1971 and 1972, President Nixon and his national security advisor and later Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, decided to reach out to the communists and establish new and better relations. And they did this to gain leverage over the Soviets in the Cold War. They did it to open up economic opportunity for the United States and the West. And frankly, they did it just to recognize as well geopolitical reality. In 1971, the PRC had 800 million people and was destined to become an economic superpower. They have 1.4 billion today in population. And in 1971, Taiwan had a population of 16 million and was going to be a meaningful trade partner, but was not going to dominate the economic scene, dominate be the right word, but was not going to play as big a presence in the economic scene as China. So we switched horses. And following that Nixon opening to China, the world quickly shifted to recognize the PRC as the legitimate government of China. And because the PRC required, as a condition of normalizing relations with the West, the world had to drop official relations with Taiwan, and Taiwan became something less than a sovereign state. And the U.S. fell in line with that. We established diplomatic relations with the PRC in 1979 during the Carter administration. And at the same time, we discontinued formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Yet, the U.S. continued to have and has strong informal relations with Taiwan, including close economic and defense relationships. And going with that, since 1979, there's been an implied, if unstated, promise on the part of the United States to defend Taiwan from any invasion coming from the mainland. So since 1979, in my mind at least, U.S. foreign policy across administrations, across political parties, has been bring China, the PRC, into the global economy with the hope of making it a responsible global citizen and facilitating a shift to a more democratic government in China. And to do this, we had to address Chinese sensitivities about Taiwan so the U.S. would act officially, at least, like it was not a sovereign state. And informally, though, we would offer a protection to Taiwan against a PRC invasion. So our hope was that we could deter the PRC from ever invading Taiwan, and at the same time deter Taiwan from declaring independence, which might be a tripwire for mainland aggression. But we wanted to keep the peace. We wanted to have economic relations with both groups, Taiwan and China. And we kept suggesting that we hope for a peaceful resolution down the road. Hopefully, when the PRC maybe became a little bit less authoritarian and Taiwan might be more willing to join them into unitary state. But Pompeo's announcement was sort of a stick in the eye to the PRC. And, everybody's wondering, or I was wondering, why did he do this? Well, I have to think in part, it's to put the Biden administration on the spot. There may be a political cost to Biden from backing off of this Pompeo initiative of appearing not to be tough on China. But there are some other commentators who have suggested that even if not intended, Pompeo's move may work out well for Biden, that it may give the Biden administration a stronger negotiating position than he otherwise would have had at the start of his administration. Now, in all events, this episode points to Taiwan as a possible hotspot in coming years and maybe even in coming months, highlighted by yesterday's Wall Street Journal editorial by Walter Russell Mead. But China has become vastly stronger militarily since the 1970s, and it could easily overwhelm Taiwan in an invasion today in the absence of the U.S. coming in a big way to Taiwan's defense. And the PRC, under its current leader, Xi Jinping, has become much more aggressive in trying to expand its influence in the region, and especially as we've talked about on other GNR programs in the South China Sea. And at the same time, there may be growing doubts about the United States' commitment to defending Taiwan. Would the U.S. really enter into a war with China, a major war with China, to defend a small country that it does not have a formal alliance with? And if these doubts that are percolating out there, they in turn have the potential to weaken our relationships in the region, other relationships we have, and not least our formal alliances with Japan and South Korea. So China and the U.S. are competing for influence in Asia, and Taiwan will be an important battleground, although hopefully not a real battleground. And the U.S. wants to deter China from attacking Taiwan. Deterrence requires that the U.S. convince China that we would go to war to defend Taiwan, and that our relationship with the Taiwanese is a vital American interest. And how do we convince them of that? And maybe Pompeo's move arguably is a small step in the direction of convincing China that Taiwan is something that they better not fool with. So, Pat, that's my comments on that.
Breck, excellent laydown of what's going on there. What's your thoughts on the likelihood that Beijing, some people say that it's inevitable that Beijing will go after Taiwan. They're seeking reunification, and they've never forsworn military means to do that. What's your read on the temperature in Beijing after this particular move? The red line has always been independence being declared by Taiwan, but this is certainly, as you put it, poking them in the eye.
Well, I guess I think two things. One, what I used to think was almost inconceivable, that is sort of back to Hitler's Germany taking over countries without any provocation or justification. And, at least I thought to some degree those days hopefully were over, but then we see Russia in the Crimea. So there's a new standard out there. The second thing I think we all probably believe it's true that if China thought there was no cost to them for invading Taiwan or putting incredible diplomatic pressure on Taiwan, I think we all think they would do that if they thought it was cost-free. And as we talked about earlier in the program, anytime the U.S. is in political turmoil, I think it raises the risk that people, authoritarian governments, see less risk in taking dramatic steps. So I think it's unlikely, but it's worrisome to me.
Well, you mentioned the inconceivability of nations invading other nations, and I can remember being in the Pentagon in 1990 when Saddam massed troops on the border with Kuwait, and everybody said, well, he's just, it's exercises. He's trying to intimidate the Kuwaitis to, lay off some recovery of loans that they had made during the Iran-Iraq war. Next thing you know, he's tank battalions are moving through Kuwait City. So that's not inconceivable. You raise the question of the cost to China. China is pretty well positioned in the world to deflect a lot of reaction from a lot of corners. And I think the conventional wisdom is whenever we have a new president, there are provocations that test the new president. specifically in 2001 when the George W. Bush administration took over. There was what was likely an intentional collision between a Chinese fighter and a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft flying in international airspace. The fighter crashed. The pilot was killed, and the U.S. aircraft, miraculously, the pilots were able to recover and land on Hainan Island. You may recall this incident. They were held there. The Chinese were able to have the run of this highly sensitive aircraft until Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State, reached kind of a face-saving move to get the crew back, and the airplane came back in boxes. You know, we're looking at Korea doing something provocative. Taiwan, if you look at the level, the volume of reaction from China over this recognition, not recognition, but change in, this is simply a change in position of some of the things we'll talk to the Taiwanese about. So from our perspective, this is not a dramatic change of events, but the Chinese are certainly viewing it differently. Nick, what's your read?
Well, just 3 points here that to make. Interestingly enough, when I was in Warsaw, Poland, and this was in 1971, 1972, that was the venue for the secret talks between the Chinese and the United States that led to ping pong diplomacy and the opening of United States relations with the People's Republic of China. So it's, you know, kind of funny that you're there. I was not aware that these talks were going on. They were very compartmentalized. There were, I think, 2 guys in the political section who had that portfolio, but they would meet in a third place, not the Chinese place, not our place, but a third place. And it worked.
Was one of those guys Forrest Gump?
No, it wasn't Forrest Gump. It was Tom Simons was his name, who was a Foreign Service officer. Second thing is that when formal diplomatic relations were broken with the Chinese, with the Taiwanese, the Chiang Kai-shek guys, basically what happened is the U.S. Embassy in Taiwan became the United States interest section in Taiwan. And the Taiwanese embassy in Washington, D.C. became their interest section. The diplomatic status of the Americans in Taiwan and the diplomatic status of the Taiwanese in Washington didn't change. So we basically withdrew formal recognition of them as a sovereign power, but as far as the diplomatic niceties were concerned, everything kind of stayed the same. And a third little point is last Sunday, I got my first COVID shot. So I'm going to get my second COVID shot on the 31st of January. And right now, in the middle of June, Rotary International has scheduled an international Rotary convention. Guess where? In Taiwan. And if I can get the COVID under control and the thing goes on, I'm going to go to Taiwan. I've never been there. Although it was before we recognized the PRC, all of the in-depth Chinese language training that was done for American diplomats. You had a year in the United States at the Foreign Service Institute, and in the second year, you would go to Taiwan and basically study Chinese in a Chinese-speaking environment. So back to your regular question, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
My sense is that that China has more to lose than to gain by trying to force something on the Taiwanese. But if the Taiwanese do cross the red line, I think China would move.
Yeah.
You can
it's
disagree,
an interesting
Breck.
situation.
No, I think that's a good analysis, and I just hope they don't move while you're over there visiting.
Well, congratulations on the COVID shots. I'm glad to see that somebody's.
Yeah, it was really, they did a great job. The Nashville public health people, and they were real organized, and you got your appointment, and away you go. So your turn will come shortly, gentlemen.
Well, if anybody hasn't seen the announcements, there are random drawings of names to receive the COVID shot every day. It's a standby system. Every morning you have to send in an email to COVID-19 standby at nashville.gov and tell them that you're prepared to show up in the 5 Points neighborhood of East Nashville. After 2:30, they'll determine if they have doses left to give that they don't want to spoil. So they're going to look at the emails that are in every day and call some people up to come and get the extra doses. So there's a little public service announcement from your Global News Review team.
There you go.
Let's wrap this up with a conversation, a brief one, about Secretary of State Pompeo and his welcoming gifts for the Biden administration. In addition to this action with Taiwan, he's also put Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, which introduces a whole new diplomatic relationship with what had been an opening of the door with Cuba during the Obama administration. And he's also designated the Houthis, the rebel group in Yemen, who are fighting against Saudi and UAE coalition over the future of Yemen against the president Hadi in Yemen. A lot of humanitarian assistance folks say that this makes it very difficult for them to do their mission to get supplies into people who are facing famine and really disastrous situations. So these are just a couple of the things that are going on in the diplomatic world that the Biden administration is going to have to come in and either sort out or see complicating the landscape for them. Dick, what do you think? The October surprise, a Christmas bonus? What's going on?
My sense, he is just dumping stuff he wants to dump and figures he doesn't have to be around for any consequences. But I think also is equally important, I think Mr. Pompeo has political ambitions that go beyond being an ex-Secretary of State. So he is positioning himself, I believe, for political involvement in the future, whether he'll run for office or whatever. But Yemen is a kind of a funny place. There are a lot more people there than I think, right? They have a big population, and this has sort of been on the screen for some time, but off the radar. I mean, you talk about a little bit, the Saudis are involved heavily in this whole thing, but the United States except through the Saudis, we really haven't been involved in this area of the world much, Yemen.
Well, I think our presence is below the radar. We have reportedly a number of special forces that are there looking for AQAP, the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Yeah. They were in Saudi Arabia in the 2003, 2005 era. The Saudis did a pretty effective job of kicking them out. So they moved to Yemen and took up some landscape there. That's where they had the bomb maker and some other characters that didn't outlast the drone campaign. But the bomb maker was the guy who crafted the shoe bomb on the airplane and the printer cartridge bomb that got onto a plane that was headed for the States, and the Saudis tipped us off. So I think U.S. Special Forces, and we've got a lot of guys in the Horn of Africa, just across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, in Djibouti, and we've got some in Somalia, although it looks like they're downsizing the Somalia presence. Yeah. So that region, there's a lot going on, as you suggest, and I don't think Americans really have a good idea of maybe we need to take up that topic. Breck, you're the historian among us. Maybe we'll take a look at Horn of Africa issues. Well, we've already talked about Ethiopia.
Queen of Sheba. Right.
Well, Breck gave us a great description of what's going on in Ethiopia with the problems with the renegade provinces, and we've got the massive dam project that the Egyptians are worried about, the Great Ethiopian Dam. And it apparently this week they were negotiating, but the talks fell apart. But we're getting far afield from Taiwan and what's going on there. So let's jump into our last topic and move the show along here. And we're going to talk a little bit about Iran and their nuclear program. I will try to avoid too much getting into the nuclear fuel cycle and putting everybody asleep. But this is an important background on what's happening between the United States and Iran. If you look at the tensions between the U.S. and Iran and our partners in the region, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, and so forth, and Iran, one of the main features of that friction is the Iranian nuclear program. And if we look back over time a little bit, and I'll just mention that in the mid 90s, when I was still wearing a Navy uniform, I was an intelligence officer at CENTCOM, and one of my portfolios as the intelligence guy looking over transnational issues was weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. And we were constantly looking at the Iranian program and obviously the Iraqi program. They were of major concern to Americans looking at what's happening in that part of the world. But let's dial back the clock a little bit and look at the Iranian program. And people would be surprised to know that the Iranian nuclear program started in the 1950s. The Shah of Iran wanted to build a Atoms for Peace U.S. program. So he got involved with the U.S. in establishing the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. And they had ambitious plans to build 20 nuclear power reactors, a uranium enrichment facility, and a reprocessing plant. And the whole idea, people say, well, countries like Iran are oil exporters. Why do they need nuclear power? Well, the rationale, and this is the case in the UAE, where they're building nuclear power plants, and the Saudis are heading in that direction, is that oil exporters need that crude oil for their revenue. So if they don't have to burn that fuel to provide energy for their domestic consumption, they can put that on the market, and that's their revenue. Especially these countries where selling petroleum is their main source of income. However, in 1979, they did succeed in building a plant at Bushehr on the Persian Gulf, which is still there and is now operational with the assistance of Russian atomic specialists. But in 1979, the Iranian Revolution deposed the Shah, and Ayatollah Khomeini moved in, but he called the nuclear program un-Islamic and ordered it terminated. And now the un-Islamic part of it has to do with building nuclear weapons. They didn't have a problem with nuclear power, but apparently there was some thought in the Iranian program that they could use the nuclear program as a cover for a weapons program. So they reversed course and in 1984 and started pushing building the Bushehr reactor and bringing that online. So currently Iran has complete nuclear fuel cycle capabilities, including uranium milling, mining, conversion, and enrichment facilities. And we'll take just a quick look here at where some of these facilities are, and they're spread out pretty far and wide over Iran. So people talk about taking out this or that facility, but you're really talking about a well-developed infrastructure that extends around the country, and you can see how big Iran is compared to imposing the map of Iran on the United States. It would extend from nearly Kansas up through the borders of Washington State. It's a very large country, and these things are spread out all over the place. Obviously, some of the facilities are more important than others, but they all play a part. Moving to the current situation, the reason that Iran is again in the news with its nuclear program is that they are moving to enrich uranium from what had been prescribed by the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. That was the agreement that the U.S. signed in 2015, along with the P5+1 powers. That's the Security Council members plus Germany and the European Union. So what's in the news now is Iran's declaration that they are refining, enriching the uranium from the low enriched levels, which were permitted under the JCPOA, to highly enriched, up to 20%, which doesn't sound like you're quite close enough to weapons grade, 90%. But as you can see in this depiction here, provided by the Nuclear Threat Institute, which is an excellent resource if you want to dig deeper into what's going on with Iran and their nuclear weapons program, as well as New START and other nuclear issues. To get from 20% to 90%, which is weapons grade material, it just requires 10% more effort compared to getting from natural uranium to the lower enriched, which takes 70% of effort. So 20% doesn't sound like much, but in reality, it puts you on the doorstep of having a nuclear weapon. The U.S. position has been that the Iranians will not be permitted to obtain a nuclear weapon. And in fact, the Iranians are a non-nuclear participant in the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they are banned by that treaty. And under the JCPOA, they agreed that they would never pursue a nuclear weapon. However, in 2018, President Trump dropped out of the JCPOA. It's still enforced by the other members of the P5+1 and Iran, but Iran last year started to break out from the provisions. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which has provided inspection regime to the facilities, all of the nuclear facilities, and has the ability to drop in and do inspections on facilities. They continue to operate in Iran, but there's indications that the Iranians may give them the boot. So this, as we see the end of the Trump administration and the opening of the Biden administration, we're looking at one more landmine that the Biden administration is going to have to deal with. I think the position announced by Mr. Biden and his advisors has been that they would like to get back into the JCPOA as a way to prevent Iran from moving further to building a weapon. And right now, the assessment is rather than a year or more away from having enough fissile material to build a nuclear weapon, they're 2 to 3 months away. So this is kind of an urgent need to resolve when President Biden takes over. The international climate in the Gulf is, it's never been a very peaceful place to sail around, having been there on ships and visits and so forth. But right now it's increasingly volatile as Iran breaks out of the JCPOA limits. So we didn't get too deep into the nuclear fuel cycle, Dick. I didn't put you asleep. You're still with us?
Are the Israelis going to allow this to occur?
Well, Israel has stated that they too would not permit Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Their leverage, they're outside of the JCPOA, so they're not a participant in
Right.
that. They do have some military capability that they've that it has been postulated they could bring to bear to attack some of these targets. But if you look at that, the laydown of targets there, you know, and it seems like every couple of years up until the JCPOA was signed, people would roll out the theory that we were going to have an air campaign against these targets. These are, there was an explosion at Natanz where they were building centrifuges last summer, and they quickly restored all that underground. These targets are deeply buried, many of the centrifuges where the fissile material is. And the United States has developed these massive bunker bombs, but they're so large that the only aircraft that can carry them are B-52s, and I believe the B-1s may be able to carry them. And occasionally we'll fly a B-52 from the U.S. over the Gulf just to remind the Iranians that we can do that. But you're talking about an air campaign of numbers of sorties that would be incredibly difficult to pull off. Our air power in the region is limited to what's based in Qatar. We have a base in Doha, Qatar, and then the aircraft carriers that come and go. The Nimitz, USS Nimitz, the aircraft carrier, was on station in the Gulf. They left to go support the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Somalia a couple of weeks ago, and they were slated to go home. They've been on deployment forever. And just a footnote here, with the pandemic, it used to be you go on a 6-month cruise and you could expect to pull in, every couple of weeks to a port and have a little R&R. But with the pandemic, these ships, the crews, the men and women on these ships are leaving their home ports and sailing, 210, 240 days, port to port, no liberty. It's a tough cruise. But anyway, the Nimitz is back on station because we had the anniversary on January 3rd of the killing of General Qasem Soleimani. So we were expecting that on the anniversary that might be the cause of some conflict with Iran. So it's a tough situation. We'll have to wait and see what the Biden administration does. Meanwhile, the Iranians are...
Well, a number of the people that Biden's bringing in on his national security team were involved in negotiating the JCPOA, right?
Right, yeah. And,
Sorry, Pat.
This week, I'll just mention that Ambassador Bill Burns was, I believe, Dick, straighten me out here, was he one of the main actors in that whole JCPOA run-up?
Yes.
He's now been named as the nominee to be director of the Central Intelligence Agency.
There is a geopolitical commentator and speaker, Peter Zeihan, I think he pronounces his last name Zeihan, and he's spoken recently on the Iran situation, and he's suggesting, I think it's an interesting argument, that the Trump administration, through its tightening up of the sanctions and its much more bellicose approach to Iran, has created perhaps, and as well, the Trump administration pulling together a lot of the Sunni nations in conjunction with Israel to oppose Iran, that he's created an opportunity for the Biden administration to strike a better deal than perhaps the Obama administration had. And while I'm sure there are guys from the Obama administration involved in this, Zeihan is arguing that at least at the senior level, it's a new group, and that even though the details of the deal might not be publicly announced if and when a deal is struck, but that it actually might be a much better deal from the United States perspective than the JCPOA. He's making that argument.
Yeah, it's going to be tough because the Biden administration has a very small window. In the short term, there's going to be an opportunity to start talking with Iranians, but the Biden administration is going to have a pretty full dance card there for the first 100 days. And then Iran gets into the Nowruz, the New Year's festival, which goes a couple of weeks. And then they're going to get into a presidential election in June. And after Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, the hardliners really were at the advantage. They were ascendant, saying that, you can't deal with the United States. And they still are making noise that why would we ever want to get back into an agreement with the United States? In 4 years, we'll have another turnover administration and they'll dump out of it. So these negotiations aren't simply going back to the table and saying, okay, here we are, let's re-sign the JCPOA. And in fact, the Iranians have added conditions. They want to be reimbursed for the economic damage that's occurred since the Trump administration left the agreement. So there we are, and we're coming up on an hour. I'll let you guys throw in your final 2 cents here, and then we'll wrap it up.
Doctor?
Dick?
Let me go first.
Breck, go ahead.
I really don't have
Breck, go ahead.
much 2 cents to throw in, except that I think this is going to be one of the most interesting historic weeks in American history, and the world is watching what goes on. There should be a vote late this afternoon. My sense is that the president will be impeached. And then the question of how the House handles sending over or not sending over the impeachment documents so that the Senate has to deal with them. The Senate is not in session, right? So they would have to come back in some kind of an emergency session if they were to deal with this right away. And, you know, you all see the same kind of speculation that I do on TV that maybe we'll, you know, give Biden 100 days without having to deal with this in the Senate, get his team through and get them officially in their chairs. So I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, Dick, I suspect you and I are news nerds. I know that you've got your TV going next to your head there. I've got one within earshot. Breck, I don't know about you. Are you consumed with the news these days?
Well, I just say in terms of last comments, I'm like everybody. I'm looking forward to 2021. It's a new start from a lot of different perspectives. And I'm hopeful, and I think everybody is probably hopeful, that our government, our federal government on both parties can find a way to work together, drop some of the ideology on both sides, and let's do that. They, you know, try pragmatically to move ahead and do what's right for the country. And I think it's a good time for us all to be hopeful about that and not be disabused of it, at least for the first 100 days.
Great. Okay, well, let's wrap it up there. We've gone a good solid hour, and I hope people have gotten something from our conversation about international reaction to the Capitol insurrection, what's going on with Taiwan, the potential for trouble for the Biden administration there, and a little backgrounder on the Iranian nuclear program. We'll be back next week. Do I see a question in the queue here? What about the question? Okay, well, I don't see a question here, so we will wrap it up.
Oh, yes, the question.
Oh,
Breck
yes,
has to give the answer.
The answer to the question.
Dick, Pat, can you put the question back up?
Yeah, here we go.
The answer.
There we go.
Americans surveyed this weekend believe President Trump bore responsibility for a deadly mob attack on the United States Capitol. What official tenet of U.S. foreign policy was undermined by the attack? And of course, its promotion of democracy. And just to make that point, I think probably there's been no more consistent tenet of American foreign policy since the beginning of our government back in the 1770s that has been more important to who we are than promotion of democracy. And it is such a sad, unfortunate circumstance that all of a sudden we're not promoting democracy in our own country. So I think that's a great question, Pat.
Mm-hmm.
All right. See, we get a little time off and we get rusty on the process here. Thanks, Dick, for keeping us on track. And Overton Colton, who said, "What about the question?" We appreciate the tip there. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. And just a reminder, please consider becoming a member of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. That's how we pay the cable bill for Ambassador Bowers and all of the other things that go along with keeping the show on the air. You can go to tnwac.org and sign up to become a member or make a financial gift. Include us in your philanthropic charitable endeavors, and we would appreciate it. Gentlemen, we'll see you next week. We have a Tuesday night Global Nashville with Carl Dean. Mayor Dean will be talking with Ralph Scholz, the president and CEO of the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce, about, well, not much going on in Nashville these days, just pandemics and explosions and stuff like that. So we'll look forward to Carl and Ralph talking about what's going on in Nashville and bringing us up to date. And that's it for us, gentlemen. Have a good week. We will talk to you all next time.
Good to see everybody.
Bye-bye.